confession of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church is taken today from chapter 6, section 3. And I'll read the section for you, and then make some comments along the way. This is in the context of Adam and Eve and their sin, and the corruption of that sin. And so we read, "They, being the root of all mankind, the guilt of this sin was imputed. The same death in sin and corrupted nature conveyed to all their posterity, descending from them by ordinary generation." So, we've considered the impact of sin on our first parents. They were corrupted through and through by their sin. Their minds, their hearts, all was corrupted by sin, and so they would experience not only that corruption, but also the guilt for sin, and also the penalty of sin, which is death itself. We now go on to consider how that sin was transferred from them to the rest of humanity, to all of their descendants. And that comes in two forms in our confession. First is by the imputation of the guilt of their sin. When we think about imputation, we are more familiar with speaking about the imputation of Christ's righteousness. When we come to faith in Jesus Christ, we have His righteousness imputed to us. That is to say that His righteousness is declared to be ours. It's considered ours. We are covered by His righteousness, and so God does not see us in our sin, but He sees us in Christ, in that perfect righteousness. And so the imputation of Christ's righteousness comes to us because He is our federal head and representative. He is the one who acted on our behalf. And so He did not act in His earthly ministry and in His death on the cross merely as a private individual in relationship to God, but He acted as our representative through it all. He stood for us. We are united to Him in His life and death by faith. And so His righteousness, that obedience to God, to the will of God that He gave during the course of His life, that righteousness has been communicated to us by imputation. It's not to say that we're automatically changed and made right with God immediately, but we have that righteousness covering us so that we are declared righteous in God's sight. Similarly, and perhaps more foundationally, the sin and guilt of Adam and Eve was also imputed to us as their descendants. God declares us guilty for their sins, even though we ourselves did not participate in that sin. We didn't eat of the forbidden fruit. We did not disobey God in the Garden of Eden. But yet we have the consequences of that sin. Why is that the case? Well, it's because Adam was our federal head and representative. He stood for us. His actions were not that of a private individual, but as the head of all of humanity. And so there was an impact of his sin on all who descend from him. And so the guilt of his sin has been transferred to all of mankind. We can read about that in Romans chapter 5, where we are told, "As by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." Well, how have we all sinned? Well, personally, we've all sinned in ourselves, in our own disobedience to God, but we have sinned in Adam as well, as he represented us in that garden. That text in Romans 5 goes on to say, "But not as the offense, so also is the free gift." So Paul is going to develop a contrast between Adam and his sin on the one hand, and Christ and His righteousness on the other. Two heads of humanity standing before us. Adam's sin brings guilt and and death to all his descendants, Christ's obedience brings life and salvation to all of his, if you will, descendants, all those who believe in him, who are represented by him as their federal head and representative. Our union with Christ is a union by faith. Our union with Adam is a union by nature. And so, if through the offense of one many be dead, that's the imputation of Adam's guilt and the consequences of that, much more the grace of God and the gift by grace, which is by one man, Jesus Christ, hath abounded unto many. And not as it was by one that sinned, so is the gift. For the judgment was by one to condemnation, but the free gift is of many offenses unto justification. For if by one man's offense death reigned by one, much more they which receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by the one, Jesus Christ. And the statement of Paul continues. So there is this imputation of Adam's sin to all of Adam's family. And that is how we have come to experience that sin. But it's also, secondly, conveyed to us by ordinary generation. We receive Adam's fallen nature by ordinary generation. So the corruption of his nature, mind, heart, will, the whole nature is passed on to all of his descendants by ordinary generation, to all their posterity descending from them by ordinary generation. The term ordinary generation is specific in that it qualifies the birth of Jesus, which was not by ordinary generation. He was born of a virgin. And so the sin of Adam and Eve was not conveyed to Jesus, because Jesus was not born by ordinary generation. He was born by the special act of God when the Spirit overshadows the Virgin Mary and produces the child within her. But we who are descended from Adam by ordinary generation receive the same death and sin and corrupted nature. And so the rebellion that Adam entered into is that rebellion that we participate in from birth. We are reminded by David in Psalm 51 verse 5, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity," or I was conceived in iniquity. "In sin my mother did conceive me," he says. And so iniquity attached itself to us right from the very earliest moments of life. It wasn't something that we have an age of innocence. And it's only until we're about 12 or 13 years of age that we are accountable to God. No, we are conceived in sin and corrupted in our sinfulness from the very earliest moments of life. Jesus said to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh." That comes by ordinary generation from Adam 1 down throughout all of history. But that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. So Adam and his natural generation, Christ and the Spirit producing faith and life in us. And that brings about a great change. And so here is how the sin of Adam becomes our sin, why we are accountable for it. If you don't like the fact that God credits us with the guilt of Adam and Eve for their sin, and we inherit their sinful nature, then you're going to have a problem with the fact that God credits the righteousness of Christ to our account, and we receive His righteousness to us. That those relationships are formed by this covenant union that we have with Adam, our first parent, and through faith in Christ as our Redeemer. And if you object to the imputation of Adam's guilt, then you have no basis to receive the imputation of Christ's righteousness either. And if anyone understands themselves and their own guilt and sin, we freely engage in sinful acts which bring condemnation to us. No matter what Adam and Eve did in the garden, we are accountable for our own personal sins, And there is no remedy for that if there is no imputation of the righteousness of Christ for us. And that imputation is by God's sovereign decree. We'll finish our consideration of the entrance of sin into the world here at this time and continue with our congregational prayer. Let's approach the Lord.